It all started with a single cruel decision. Sarah's service dog, Bruno, was deemed unacceptable by the HOA. The president, Karen, claimed Bruno posed a threat, despite all evidence to the contrary. When Sarah stood up for him, Karen smirked, threatening to ruin her life. But Sarah knew something Karen didn't. There was more to this fight than just a dog, and when the truth came out, everything changed. But let's start from the beginning. Sarah Miller had always dreamed of a fresh start, and the quiet, suburban neighborhood seemed like the perfect place for her and her 5-year-old son, Josh. After a devastating personal loss, Sarah was determined to create a safe and stable environment for her little family. Helping her every step of the way was Bruno, her loyal service dog, a well-trained Labrador who provided Sarah with invaluable support as she managed the emotional weight of post-traumatic stress. For Sarah, Bruno was more than a companion. He was a lifeline. Their new home was cozy and inviting, with a small, sunlit backyard where Josh could play and Sarah could finally feel a semblance of peace. But peace was short-lived. It came in the form of Karen, the president of the local homeowners association, HOA, who introduced herself with a tight smile and a stack of rules. Karen's presence was hard to ignore. Her sharp voice carried over fences, and her ever-watchful eyes seemed to miss nothing. At first, Sarah tried to keep things cordial, even accommodating. She made sure Bruno always wore a service vest, kept him on a leash during walks, and cleaned up meticulously after him. But it quickly became clear that Karen had her own ideas about how the neighborhood should operate. Karen believed in rules, strict, unbending rules, and it didn't matter that federal law protected Bruno as a service animal. To Karen, rules were rules, and Bruno, being a large dog, was a violation of HOA policy. The first sign of trouble came on a crisp autumn morning. Josh was in the backyard tossing a ball to Bruno, their laughter ringing out in the quiet neighborhood. Suddenly, Karen appeared at the fence, her expression stern. "I'm afraid your dog doesn't comply with our regulations," she announced, her tone leaving no room for discussion. "You'll need to make arrangements." Sarah, caught off guard, calmly explained that Bruno was a service animal and presented the necessary documentation. Karen's response was curt. "That may be the case, but we have rules for a reason. Large dogs can be unpredictable." Sarah tried to keep her voice steady, though her hands trembled slightly. "Bruno isn't just a dog. He's here to help me. He's trained and certified. He's not a threat to anyone." Karen's tight smile returned, though it was anything but friendly. "We'll see about that." A few days later, Sarah heard a knock at her door. Standing there was an officer from Animal Control, clipboard in hand, with Karen lurking just behind him. The officer politely explained that they'd received a report of an aggressive dog in the neighborhood. Bruno, lying calmly at Sarah's feet, tilted his head as if puzzled by the accusation. Sarah's heart pounded as she showed the officer Bruno's certification and shared his role in her life. The officer nodded sympathetically, but explained that they were obligated to investigate any complaints. Karen, emboldened by the scene, began speaking over Sarah, listing false claims. Bruno had barked aggressively, scared a child, and acted threateningly toward neighbors. Sarah could hardly believe what she was hearing. She felt a lump rise in her throat, but refused to let herself cry in front of Karen. The officer, after a thorough look at Bruno's calm demeanor, concluded there was no immediate issue, but advised Sarah to keep records of Bruno's activities just in case. Karen scoffed loudly, muttering something about favoritism as she stormed off. As Sarah closed the door, she leaned against it, her mind racing. How had her attempt at a peaceful life turned into this? Looking down at Bruno, who wagged his tail reassuringly, she resolved not to let Karen's baseless complaints go unanswered. For now, though, she couldn't shake the sinking feeling that this was just the beginning. Life in the neighborhood was beginning to feel like a waking nightmare for Sarah. The first incident with Animal Control had left her shaken, but she tried to move forward, believing the worst was behind her. Unfortunately, Karen had other plans. What started as a tense disagreement quickly spiraled into a campaign of relentless harassment. Sarah began finding notes taped to her front door, cold, impersonal warnings written in sharp, curt handwriting. "Remove the dog or face further action," one read. Another was more direct. You're not welcome here with that animal." It wasn't just the notes. Karen, seemingly determined to isolate Sarah, began spreading false rumors among the neighbors. She claimed Bruno barked incessantly through the night, disturbing the peace, and even accused him of damaging lawns. Accusations as far from the truth as they were hurtful. Sarah would catch glimpses of Karen talking animatedly with other residents, pointing in the direction of her home. The whispers and disapproving looks that followed were impossible to ignore. Feeling the pressure, Sarah decided to take the high road. She invited Karen over for tea, hoping to resolve things peacefully. She prepared the small dining table in her cozy kitchen with a pot of chamomile tea and freshly baked muffins, determined to show Karen the person behind the unfair labels. When Karen arrived, she sat stiffly, her gaze scanning the room as if searching for something to criticize. "Karen," Sarah began gently, her hands wrapped around her mug for comfort. "I know you have concerns, but I want to explain why Bruno is so important to me. He helps me in ways I can't even put into words. He's trained to keep me grounded during difficult moments." Karen leaned back, arms crossed, her expression hardening with every word. When Sarah finished, Karen let out a sharp laugh. "So what? You're saying you can't follow the rules like everyone else because you need your dog as a crutch?" Honestly, it sounds like an excuse to me. Sarah's heart sank. She had hoped for understanding, but instead she was met with ridicule. Karen stood abruptly, brushing crumbs from her lap. "Rules exist for a reason, Sarah. If you can't handle them, maybe this isn't the neighborhood for you." With that, she walked out, leaving Sarah sitting alone, the tea growing cold in her cup. The situation only worsened from there. At the next HOA meeting, Karen presented a list of complaints, purportedly signed by multiple neighbors. She claimed Bruno's barking had become a nuisance and that his presence violated HOA regulations. Sarah was stunned as Karen confidently waved the list in front of the group. But then, something unexpected happened. A few neighbors began to push back. "That's not true," said Mrs. Thompson, an elderly woman who lived across the street. "I've never heard Bruno bark once." "Yeah," chimed in another resident, "and he's always on a leash. I've seen him. He's one of the calmest dogs I've ever met." Karen's composure faltered for a moment, but she quickly recovered, brushing off the objections. "Well, not everyone feels comfortable speaking out," she said, flashing a tight smile. "I'm simply representing their concerns." Sarah felt a flicker of hope. It seemed she wasn't as alone as Karen wanted her to believe. The meeting ended without any resolution, but the support from her neighbors gave Sarah the strength to keep fighting. Later that week, she learned that several of the complaints Karen had submitted were forged. Neighbors whose names appeared on the list swore they had never signed anything. As Sarah pieced together the extent of Karen's manipulations, she began to see a clearer path forward. Karen's attempts to smear her and Bruno were falling apart, and the neighborhood, once wary of her, was starting to see Karen's true colors. For the first time in weeks, Sarah felt the weight on her chest begin to lift. She still had a fight ahead of her, but now she knew she wasn't facing it alone. The tension in the neighborhood was palpable as Sarah made her way to the upcoming HOA meeting. After weeks of enduring harassment and false accusations, she knew it was time to take a stand. Armed with evidence, a newly hired attorney, and the quiet but growing support of her neighbors, Sarah was determined to expose the truth. She had also reached out to a local journalist who found the story compelling. A single mother fighting against systemic harassment. It was a narrative that resonated with many. The evening of the meeting was brisk, the air carrying a hint of autumn chill. Sarah entered the community hall with Bruno walking calmly at her side, his presence steady and reassuring. The room buzzed with murmurs, a mix of curiosity and tension hanging in the air. Karen stood at the head of the room, exuding her usual air of authority. She seemed confident, even smug, as if the outcome of the meeting had already been decided. But Sarah had come prepared. When the floor was opened for her to speak, she stepped forward, her voice steady despite the knot of nerves in her chest. "I want to address the ongoing complaints about my service dog Bruno," she began, her eyes scanning the room. "I know there have been claims that he's disruptive, aggressive, and a nuisance. Tonight, I'm here to prove otherwise." She reached into her bag and pulled out a flash drive, which her attorney handed to the meeting organizer. Within moments, video clips began to play on the large screen at the front of the room. The footage showed Bruno in his daily life, calmly lying at Sarah's feet during errands, playing gently with her son in the yard, and even interacting politely with neighbors who stopped to say hello. The room was silent as the clips played, each one a quiet testament to Bruno's gentle and well-trained nature. Karen's face tightened as the videos continued. She interrupted, her voice sharp. "This is irrelevant. We have rules for a reason, and Sarah's disregard for them threatens the order of this community." Sarah took a breath, her resolve unshaken. "Karen, I'm not here to threaten anyone. I'm here to defend my right to live peacefully in this neighborhood with my service dog, a right protected by law." Before Karen could respond, a voice from the back of the room spoke up. It was Mr. Jenkins, a retired veteran who had lived in the neighborhood for over a decade. He slowly rose from his seat, his weathered face calm but resolute. "I know what it's like to rely on a service dog," he said, his voice steady but laced with emotion. "After my service, I wouldn't have made it through some of the toughest days without my own companion. These animals are more than pets, they're lifelines." The room broke into soft murmurs, and several people nodded in agreement. Mr. Jenkins continued, his voice rising slightly. "I have seen Bruno around. He's as gentle as they come. If anyone's threatening the peace of this community, it's not Sarah or her dog. It's the relentless pursuit of trying to push them out." His words were met with applause, a wave of support that seemed to ripple through the room. Sarah felt a swell of gratitude, her earlier apprehension giving way to a sense of solidarity. Karen, however, looked visibly unsettled, her previously unshakable confidence now cracking under the weight of collective dissent. As the meeting concluded, several neighbors approached Sarah to voice their support, offering kind words and promises to stand with her. The local journalist, who had quietly observed the proceedings, approached Sarah as well, expressing interest in sharing her story more broadly. For the first time in what felt like ages, Sarah felt a glimmer of hope. The tide was beginning to turn, and Karen's grip on the narrative was slipping. While there was still work to be done, this evening had proven one thing beyond a doubt. Sarah was not alone in her fight, and the truth was on her side. As Sarah continued her fight to protect her rights and her dog, she had no idea that the most shocking twist of the story was yet to come. After gathering legal support, she had turned to an attorney who specialized in cases involving local governance. Together, they began to dig into the financials of the Homeowners Association, HOA. What they uncovered was nothing short of scandalous. Sarah's attorney discovered that Karen had been using the HOA's budget for personal expenses, including significant payments for repairs to her own house. These charges were filed under vague and misleading categories, making them difficult to trace, until now. The realization sent a ripple through the community. People had trusted Karen with their dues and their concerns, only for her to betray that trust by pocketing funds meant to maintain their neighborhood. It was the kind of betrayal that left a bad taste in your mouth, like a lie told with a smile. With mounting evidence in hand, Sarah didn't hesitate. She pushed for an official audit of the HOA's finances. The community hall, once full of tension and division, now became the scene of a powerful revelation. News of the discovery spread like wildfire, with neighbors gossiping and whispering, exchanging shocked glances as the truth about Karen's misdeeds unfolded. But Karen wasn't ready to admit defeat, far from it. When the news broke, she tried to retaliate by filing a lawsuit against Sarah, accusing her of slander and claiming that the accusations were false. She believed that by turning the tables and painting Sarah as the villain, she could win the support of the community back. And yet, it didn't go as she planned. In fact, the courtroom became another stage for Sarah's defense of her integrity. The judge, after reviewing the evidence, both the misappropriation of HOA funds and the ongoing harassment of Sarah, quickly dismissed Karen's claims as unfounded. Not only was Karen's lawsuit thrown out, but in a turn of justice, she was ordered to pay a fine for filing a frivolous lawsuit and misusing the HOA's funds for personal gain. Sarah sat quietly in the courtroom as the ruling was made, her heart racing. She had won, but the victory wasn't without its toll. The stress of the battle had been immense, but as she walked out of the courthouse, a sense of vindication washed over her. The community now knew the truth, and the weight that had pressed so heavily on her shoulders for so long began to lift. Back in the neighborhood, things began to shift. Neighbors who had once been hesitant to get involved now came forward with support. Some even joined a petition to ensure stricter financial oversight within the HOA. Karen, meanwhile, became a pariah, her reputation tarnished beyond repair. The once untouchable leader of the HOA was now under the microscope herself. Sarah could hardly believe the events that had transpired. It had been a journey full of emotional highs and crushing lows, but she had come out on top. For the first time in a long while, she felt a sense of peace, knowing that the truth had prevailed and that she had done everything in her power to protect herself, her son, and her loyal companion, Bruno. The battle was over, but the lesson would stay with her forever. Standing up for what's right was never easy, but it was always worth it. And the neighborhood? It too would never be the same. The experience had shown them that silence in the face of injustice only allows it to thrive. But when ordinary people found the courage to speak out, they could change the world around them, one small but vital step at a time. After months of emotional and legal battles, the day of the final judgment arrived. Sarah sat in the courtroom, her hands clasped tightly together, her mind racing. The tension in the air was palpable, as if the very walls of the room were holding their breath. The judge listened intently to the arguments, weighing the evidence with the seriousness it deserved. And then the moment came. The decision was announced. Sarah had won. The relief that washed over Sarah was overwhelming. After all the stress, the fear, and the uncertainty, the truth had prevailed. Karen, once the undisputed chairwoman of the HOA, was removed from her position. The power she had wielded for so long was stripped away in an instant, like a sudden storm that sweeps away all in its path. She had failed, not just in her attempts to destroy Sarah's life, but in her abuse of power. But the victory didn't stop there. The new leadership of the HOA, realizing the depth of Karen's betrayal, publicly apologized to Sarah for the harm that had been caused. It was a bittersweet apology, but an apology nonetheless, an acknowledgement that Sarah had been wronged and that the community had failed her. As a sign of good faith, the new board even proposed amendments to the HOA rules, making it clear that something like this would never happen again. They promised more transparency, stricter financial oversight, and a commitment to ensuring that the voices of the residents would always be heard. Sarah's life, once upended by the conflict, began to return to normal. The weight that had been pressing down on her shoulders lifted, and she could finally breathe. She and Bruno returned to their peaceful routine. No more threatening notes, no more whispered accusations. The quiet comfort of her home, the soothing presence of Bruno by her side, felt like a blessing she hadn't realized she'd missed so much. Bruno, too, had become a local hero, a beloved figure in the neighborhood. His calm, loyal presence was a symbol of strength and resilience to everyone who had watched the battle unfold. As for the neighbors, many of them had seen Sarah in a new light. Where once there was skepticism or indifference, now there was respect. The woman who had stood up for her rights, who had fought not just for her own peace, but for the good of the whole community, was now seen as a beacon of courage. Her journey had inspired others to do the same, to speak out when they saw injustice, and to stand firm when the odds seemed insurmountable. Sitting on her porch one evening, watching Bruno chase a ball across the yard, Sarah couldn't help but smile. She had fought a battle and won, not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been silenced by fear or intimidation. The fight had been long and hard, but it had been worth it. And as she looked at the peaceful street, now filled with neighbors who had learned the value of standing up for what's right, Sarah realized that she had done something more than win a legal case. She had ignited a spark of change. In her victory, others had found the courage to fight for their own truths, their own rights. They had seen what one determined person, standing firm against injustice, could accomplish. In the end, it wasn't just about winning a fight. It was about proving something much deeper, that even the most daunting of adversaries can be overcome when you stand up for your principles and your loved ones. And as the sun set behind her house, casting a golden glow over the neighborhood, the words came to her, words that seemed to capture everything she had learned on this journey. Sarah proved that even the fiercest adversary cannot defeat someone who stands up for their principles and those they love.